Okay, so what I'm going to do today is tell you a little bit about what's going on there and why it matters and why we should care in this image. All right, so I'm going to take you through what's going to be sort of a moment from a book project that I'm currently trying to finish up. But what I want to do as part of that is effectively introduce you to a guy I think is super cool and really interesting that we don't otherwise know a whole lot more about, who's a poet and a translator. So this is going to be a talk about poetry, about translation, about the sight of and the understanding of and the practice of translation in the 19th century that comes somewhat before, a little bit contemporary with what we just heard about in the panel just before. And I also just want to introduce you to some super cool poetry while we do that. So let's do it. But first, go with me to an imaginary space, okay? And we're going to do this just for a few minutes. Imagine yourself having just arrived to a dinner party and looking around at a room full of people. We can imagine them sitting around a table at a dinner to which we've invited them. The translators, the movers of words, the anatomists of language, the architects of broken and of breakable structures, the Siamese interpreters, Woman La and his colleagues, Wang Zulong, the student of Mongolian language, and Konichi, the author of a textbook that Wang Zulong used. They've come as a couple, though they lived more than 2 centuries apart. The Jesuit missionary and grammarian Ferdinand Verbiest, the Manchu teacher and textbook author Uga, and the Qing poet and the Manchu Chinese translator Bujilgin Jakdan. Each of them has brought a book, as we've asked them to do. Each of these volumes represents a crucial point, a crucial turning point in the history of translation and of language in early modern China. Each embodies a means by which translation helped reconfigure for Ming and Qing readers of various sorts what a language was, what it was built of, and what it could be. Each work offers a glimpse into the art and the craft of a translator, the music of his language, his skill as a cartographer of thoughts, his ability as a navigator, weaving through dark waters and leaving landmarks in his wake. He is a magician who conjures phantoms into being, ghosts of his own multiple selves that whisper to one another in phrases half understood. Ghosts of the magicians who came before him. Ghosts of flowers and of beasts and of cities and of children and of libraries full of pages that they spin from ink and from air. Now these men have no spoken language in common, but they can share their stories by singing them into being in some cases, or by writing them using Chinese script in others. They spend most of the night and the early morning doing just that. Now, at some point in their lives, most of these men have called Beijing, the city of Beijing, home. But what is home for a mover of and with language? And where is home for a man who spends most of his life in transit? Their cities are not built with walls or streets. They have no rooftops or sitting rooms. They have no orchards and no rivers. Instead, these men live in cities of ink and paper, and vowels made of air in round or sharp edges. Their cities are carved into woodblocks, or they're breathed into gardens and classrooms. They're inhabited by the artists and the pirates of language who helped make them. Theirs are cities legible and illegible. To read them, hear them, speak them, is to travel through them, or to find oneself lost in them, or both. Not all of them wanted this, as they gradually revealed to us over the course of the meal. One of them had dreamt of a life in Central America before he was sent to work in China. Another one had illusions of spending his life as a respected and well-known author, rather than earning what tiny fame he had by doing work that he considered somewhat below him. And we'll hear a little bit more about him in the time to come. 3 of them were still celebrating their collective luck in securing an adventure that took them to the Ming court before they were effectively kidnapped by the Ming and told that they would not, in fact, be returning home from their adventure. The languages they worked in had ranged from Thai to Mongolian, Latin to Tibetan, French, Manchu, Uyghur, and Dutch. Some were deeply interested in the work, and for others, translation was really just a means to an end, a comfortable job in the civil service, an emperor converted to Christianity, a life spent working for a foreign court rather than a violent death at its hands. We're meeting them in their prime, at the moment of completing a masterwork of translation. Now, for some, that prime finds them in early adulthood, and for others, it finds them well into old age. As dinner concludes, we ask our translators to play a game for us over dessert. Each man is to tell his story using the text he's brought with him to dictate the shape of that story. Now, if I had time today, I would tell you the stories of each of these men, or rather, I'd allow you, or I'd let you listen in as they told their own stories using the works of language and translation that they themselves have written. And they would tell their stories to us by taking us through those texts. We would listen to Wang Zongzai, a puppet director of an important Ming political faction, in the year that he became director of the Translators College and presided over a newly formed bureau devoted to the script of Siam. And this is a page from one of the works that was generated at that Translators College. We would listen to Wang Zulong, a particularly successful student working at the Mongolian Translation Bureau with a bilingual collection of Mongolian diplomatic documents. He would talk to us about exams and about courses and about life being hard. We're going to hear a lot about that actually in the time to come, and about how to shape your mouth and your tongue, your palate in particular ways to produce particular kinds of Mongolian sounds, and how to use Chinese characters in an unusual way in order to map that cartography of the mouth. We would listen to Ferdinand Verbiest, a Jesuit missionary whose Latin grammar of the Manchu language gave it an architecture, literally an architecture, a built structure of nouns and verbs and adjectives for the very first time. And we would listen to Uga, who taught Manchu to a room full of students out of his own home, as he performed for us conversations from a manual that he wrote for bannermen who were learning to speak Manchu. And those conversations, incidentally, are hilarious. Like when you think of, this was, I can tell you a little bit about this in the questions to come if you want. This was a guidebook of 52 monologues and dialogues used in classrooms to teach men, and they were all men, how to speak Manchu, that featured, and a lot of them, these two figures who were constantly arguing with one another. You're such a jerk. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. Why didn't you come to visit me yesterday? I was busy. Some of us need to work for a living. Oh, shut up. No, you shut up. And there are a lot of conversations in this like early 18th century conversation manual in Manchu that we have. So we can talk about that later as well. Now, in the book that I'm currently trying to finish, knock wood, end of the summer, there are chapters that do all of these things, okay? So stay tuned, and I'm also happy to talk about any one of them. But today, what we're going to do is spend a little bit of time listening to and exploring the work of a particular man. This is the final one to tell his story. So let's listen as he sings to us a bit, and he's singing quite a bit of a lament. I'll translate it into English for you. This is an English version of the first poem that he's going to sing for us. Who, me? What's so rare? My talent is spare. I'm as wise as a wood stump, a plain thing dressed up. My fame as a translator has spread, but there's still my poor family, my whitening hair. I'm all alone, my fists full of air. What gown do I wear? A simple robe. I'm unskilled. I must walk into work to get there. My cutting board spare, just odd meat bits. My wash basin spare, made of clay and not copper. The oven bed's chilly, the hearth's cold and bare. Okay, so these are the first words of a poem called A Song Sung Drunkenly. And this is a poem that also celebrates the virtues of being drunk. Now, any of us who have any kind of experience reading anything in Chinese literature will recognize this as a very important theme. And as you hear a little bit, and I'll take you through, this person was not only a poet who wrote his own work in Manchu and in mixed Manchu Chinese verse, but he was also a skilled translator. And many of the poems that he translated did celebrate as well the virtues of being drunk. Now, this poet and translator was named Jack Dan. Jack Dan in Manchu means pine, okay? So his name meant a pine tree, and you'll be hearing much more about him in the time to come. Now, this song, and this is, what I just read to you is an English translation of the first part of this. This would have been accompanied by music, ideally, from a three-stringed instrument and possibly a drum. And what this is the first page of a Manchu text from the only known copy of this in the world. And this is a manuscript copy in the Harvard Yenjing Library. Now, what this is a work by Jack Dan in 8 volumes. The first 7 volumes consist of his translations of various sorts of Chinese poetry. And they include poetry attributed to Qing emperors. They include poetry by Tang poets. There's some Du Fu in here, there's some Li Bai. These are some of the only Manchu versions of these poems that I know have exist. And we have virtually no studies of them. And one of the things that maybe we could talk about after this is the way that even sort of translations of any sort tend to be devalued as literary products. And that's ironically, as you'll hear in a little bit, that's even the case here, where this particular Manchu poet's translations of Chinese into Manchu have been pretty much ignored because they're mere translations. And hopefully we'll be hearing a lot more about that in the years to come. Okay, so how many of you read Manchu or have read Manchu? That's what I thought. Okay, so what we're seeing when we see this page, what you do, you start a page of Manchu manuscript like this over here, okay? You start at the top and you read down. So we start here, we read down, okay? This over here, the second line is the title, and then it starts with the text, and then you flip it over and you do the same thing. So that's what we're doing when we read Manchu. The Manchu script is a modified version of the classical Mongolian script, which itself is a modified version of Uyghur script, which when Chinggis in his conquests took over some Naiman tribes who had used Uyghur scholars as scribes, he then also took these Uyghur scholars as scribes, and thus the Uyghur script became used as classical Mongolian, and that is a version of Sogdian. If you kind of flip it on its side, you'll get Uyghur, which gets us to classical Mongolian, which gets us to Manchu. The difference here is that Manchu has a series of dots and circles that'll tell you things that classical Mongolian doesn't tell you. It'll tell you when a letter is supposed to be a ta versus a da. Mongolian doesn't tell you that except with vowel harmony, etc., etc. So anyway, I'm happy to talk about this in more fascinating detail if you want after, but this is what you're seeing. And what you're going to be seeing over the course of the rest of the time tonight is you're going to be seeing lots of images from this particular manuscript from Harvard Yenjing, okay? And we're going to be talking about materials from it. This is a manuscript called Sokporalame Ging Shiha Uchun. Okay, so this is another page of this. Again, there's 7 volumes here of Manchu translations of Chinese poems, and there's 1 volume of original Manchu and Manchu Chinese poetry. And only really a handful of people have worked on this. All right, so the final volume of this work consists of his original Manchu and Manchu Chinese poems on all sorts of topics. So these are the poems that are in the 8th jar, the 8th volume, and you'll see, I'll take you through, one of the things that we'll do today, or a lot of what we'll do today is I'll take you through some of them. They include a song or lyrics in praise of tobacco, where he talks about how to smoke tobacco, the difference between tobacco and opium. He blames local tribes people, that's the language in Manchu, for corrupting the Qing by bringing opium into society. He has a text of offering to the beard god, and I'll tell you about that. He has texts devoted to flowers. He has texts that talk about sort of important moments in Chinese history and in Chinese literature, and we'll talk about some of that. And he talks a lot here about issues that I'm going to argue for you come fundamentally from his experience as a translator. Okay? And that's going to be one of the touchstones of our time today. And these are the poems that are in that volume. Okay. So, obligatory map of the Qing. Jack Tan was probably born in the 1780s into a relatively poor family, though we don't really know the dates. Okay, we don't have clear dates of his birth. He was a Manchu bannerman. He was a member of the plain red Manchu banner, and we know that in part because that's how he is attributed in the works that we have from him, though it was unclear where he lived and it was unclear where he was raised. It's likely that he received an education in the Manchu language while he was growing up, likely in a banner school. Okay? Now, whatever he did prepared him to take an exam to qualify for a status as a metropolitan graduate in translation. So now I'm going to give you just like 45 seconds of the boring administrative stuff, but that some people are interested in. And so if you're interested, here is this for you. So he got status as a metropolitan graduate in translation, which gives him an official position as a translator in 1826. At this point, he's 40-something. Okay? He's in his 40s. Right? Now, he passed the exam. He ranks second of 4 successful candidates, and he secures himself a degree as a result and a post. Those administratively interested in you are going to love this, as second-class secretary of the Board of Works in Mukden. I know you're shivering. It's so exciting. This is today's Shenyang. It's the old Manchu capital. He also secures for himself a stable income, sort of. And we'll get to what that meant for him and what he thought about that in a moment. Now, what this is, what you're seeing here, is actually an exam from about 100 years earlier, but just to give you a sense of what this kind of document looked like. This is an example of a Manchu translation exam from the UCLA collection. So for those of you who are interested in examination history, UCLA has a really great collection of texts and exam papers from this period, and there's lots and lots of Manchu translation exams there. And so this is one of them, just to give you a visual of what this kind of source looked like. Okay. But even though he had a salary, coming back to our first poem, you'll remember Jack Dan's complaints, right? Now, in a song sung drunkenly, he complains of this. What I want to do with the rest of my time here is to take you through some of his other poetry. Now, why is this interesting and important to do? Hopefully, we'll talk about that in a little bit. But one of the things that I think is really interesting in this poetry is he talks a lot about what it is to be a translator. Now, this is not somebody who's a 19th century translator in the vein that we often read about, right? We often read about, in fascinating and important and fabulously interesting ways, we read about people who are translating to and from Chinese and European or Anglophone languages, or European languages or English, right? So part of what I want to do is to read some of what's going on here, and to read it critically, because I don't think we can self-evidently take the content of what he says as the truth, right? But we do have a sense of at least how he is relating his understanding of the experience of what it is to be a translator in this particular medium. And I think there's some interesting things happening there. Okay. So what the book chapter does, and this is, again, you heard this is inspired, but what the book chapter does, and this is part of the Calvino inspiration, it uses, as the rest of the book does, invisible cities as a kind of inspiration and trope for organizing the narrative. How many of you have read Invisible Cities? Okay, next time I ask you, all of the hands should go up because it's an amazing book. And what I'm taking from that book and from Calvino's work specifically is his approach to, his interest in, and his work as a member of OLIPO, the Society for Potential Literature. Okay, so what that means is that he's part of a group of people who are playing with constraints on narrative form to try to generate new forms of stories. So if people have heard of work that came out of this group, often they've heard of the novel that was read without, or that was written without the letter E. It got translated into English as avoid, right? And so what happens when you put a constraint on the kind of story that you can tell? How does that generate creative possibilities? That's part of what I'm interested in his craft, and that's a lot of what's happening in Invisible Cities. Why am I telling you all this? Because that's the inspiration for how this book and this chapter in particular work. Each one of the chapters of the book takes a particular text. That glossary that I showed you, the collection of paired bilingual documents. The first word of a phrase book. Here, the titles of a series of poems. And it uses that as the organizing premise for the entire chapter. So what the chapter does is it imagines Jack Dan singing to us all of these songs in order, and through that process, it narrates the story of the chapter, which is a story of what it is to be and to practice translation as a Manchu scholar working in Manchu and Chinese in the middle of the 19th century. I'm not going to do that for you. We don't have that much time. But instead, what I'm going to do is take you into moments of some of these poems to try to open up what I think we can get by reading them as documents, by understanding them as part of a history of and with translation. And also, there's some pretty cool stuff going on there. Okay, so let's do it. Part of what's inside is Jack Dan conveying what it's like for him to live as a translator in the early 19th century, and he complains about this a lot. When I give talks about him, I call him the Rodney Dangerfield of Manchu translators. I don't get no respect. Nobody likes me. I don't have enough money. Everything sucks. All right, so he complains about this in the poem After a Song Sung Drunkenly, which we just saw a bit of. This next poem is a song mumbled in my sleep, which I just love, right? Polgirilame orire uchulen. And you can see the first pages here. And again, as we know now, we're experts in Manchu. You start there and you go away, or you go that way. Thumb is optional, but you can read that and materiality of that as a text. Lee can ask me, so Carla, what happens if you read the thumb as part of the text? So to get me back for my question before. Okay, so here is the first bit of this in Manchu. Okay, and what we're doing is we're starting from there. Okay, the 1, 2, third line over, the first full line, it starts at the top. Bisachi, and it goes down. And I'm going to just read you a little bit of that so you can hear some Manchu, and then we'll move on. Bisachi aisen, banjitan mentuhun, yayargian by algin, gabu hasutai, banin mufuyen, gisun yalangi, yabun sijihun, mekala kitchen husun, ibini tachin funjin, muthen eberi, bangsen ekiyahun. And you can sort of hear, one of the reasons I want you to hear a little bit of the Manchu is you can hear a little bit of the rhyme, right? You can hear a little bit of the musicality, and even just in that, you have the you have the rhymes. There's a lot of really interesting music happening there, which is, I think, one of the beautiful things about his work. Okay. What use am I? Again, he's complaining. I was born a fool. What's genuine about me? Just my repute, my reputation. I'm famously odd, and I look to be dull. True are my words, and good's what I do. But they make no difference, my muscle and oomph. Where's the proof I went to school? My potential is lacking. I'm incapable too. Now what you're seeing here is a stumbling effort in the English to try to reproduce some of the sonic relationships in the Manchu. And if you want, later we can talk about that. I think perhaps all of us in the room on some level are translators of necessity or of desire. Some of us may love that. Some of us may just grudgingly do that because it's part of what we do as Asian studies scholars to do our work. And there are a lot of different approaches to translating a poem, right? Are you just going to go for literal meaning and not worry about the meter or the rhyme? Or are you going to try to transform it into a conventional poetic genre or form in the language that you're translating it into? This is an experiment, which may or may not stay there, that involves a lot of highlighting things in different colors. Like, hey, this is all the pink parts rhyme in a certain way, so then I'm going to do something where all the pink parts rhyme in a certain way. Anyway, this is an experiment in trying to evoke the kind of patterning of the sound of the Manchu in the English. And so that's why some of the word choice is there. Okay, so here Jack Dan laments not only his lot in life as an underpaid and underappreciated translator, but also the skill he brings to his craft. And here's what he goes on to say. It's again from this poem that you're seeing. My Manchu and Chinese writings are shallow. Archery and horseback talents are weak. messy and awkward, entangled, contradictory. I have long deviated from scholarship. I'm rubbish in practical affairs. And this is what he tells us in this poem. Now he continues on in the vein above, lamenting his poverty and his debt, his lack of family property, his humble position. Life sucks, right? I mean, many of us who are academics, who are either grad students now or have been, can sympathize with this. I eat ramen all the time, like my hair's falling out because I'm malnourished. I mean, he doesn't say that, but basically, like, he's basically saying that. Okay, so since he didn't enjoy a high government position, he complained, he also had no power to improve state policies, to improve the welfare of the people. He was unable, and he says this specifically, he's unable to pacify fights among adjacent villages when they broke out. And he's concerned about this. Like, he feels like he should be able to do this. So again, as in the first song, he describes the characteristics of those powerful men who had all the things, who could do all the things that he couldn't. So here's what these men are. They're fashionable, they have fancy clothes, they can speak really well, they're smart, they're wealthy, they're tactful. They sat on fat horses and wore delicate furs. While they did that, he says, he looked through perforated paper windows and stored his food in broken jars. And so there's some really interesting, a really interesting domestic material landscape that emerges from these poems if you're looking for that and if you're open to that. So I'll just flag that as one possible sort of interesting way into this work. Why you all should just learn Manchu, read Daken's poems. Actually, though some people are a few of us are talking about doing a translation of these into English, so stay tuned. Okay, while these rich men had money and servants to acquire and prepare rich food, he says, he lubricated his meals with sour wine and bitter sauces. Still, he says, he contented himself. He may not have brocades and musicians, jewels, or perfumes, and he mentions all of these things, but the natural world around him provided a kind of luxury sensorium for the man who is willing to see, hear, touch, and smell it that way. So he's surrounded, he says, by a natural world that spoke to him in a beautiful language. And I love this, and you'll hear a little bit of why I was asking about onomatopoeia a little bit earlier. He sung that language for his reader, and I really love when he does this. He says, kurikari. This is the voice the plants use to speak to the eyes with their colored dappling. And this is not a translation of his work. This is just my reading of what's going on when he's evoking these sounds. Jing, jing, jang, jang. This is the voice the birds used to speak to the ears with their chirping and twittering. Gilta, gilta. This is the voice the grasses used to speak to the fingers as they glistened wetly with raindrops. Guksen, guksen. This is the voice the flowers used to speak to the nose with their intense fragrance. Now, Japtan was a translator, and what he's doing here in his original Manchu poems, and again, these are his writings, he's showing that he's equally adept at rendering the language of nature for human eyes and also for human ears, as he was at mediating between Manchu and Chinese. And it's just, I think, really beautiful poetry. So despite his sense of the importance of his own work, the kind of translation work that he and his collaborators were doing is usually left out of the larger story of Qing translation in the 19th century, which tends to focus, again, on texts and translators who are contending with the social and scientific ideas coming into the Qing from elsewhere, okay, from other language sources. Now, while he was writing some of the work that he'd become known for in 1848, at the same time, many of the figures who would go on to dominate the history of Qing translation hadn't yet been born. And we know some of these people, right? Like Yan Fu, the celebrated translator of Darwin, and Spencer, Huxley, and Adam Smith, and John Stuart Mill. Lin Shu, who Michael Gibbs Hill has beautifully written about in a book that everyone should read if you're interested in translation. I think it's called Lin Shu Inc. And Lin Shu is translating Uncle Tom's Cabin, Aesop's Fables, the work of Charles Dickens and Washington Irving into Chinese, despite knowing none of the original languages, which is fascinating. Also Nat Lu Shun, who translated, among other things, works by Gogol and Jules Verne. Okay, now works in modern European languages at this point are just coming into the forefront. of the labors of Chinese translators. So very much what this project is hoping to do is just shift our gaze a little bit so that when we think of the 19th century and when we think of translation in the 19th century, we're not forgetting the importance of that really crucial labor and work, but we're broadening a little bit what we think about and how we think about China and the languages of China in this period. It's not just Chinese. So in 1848, and this is how most people hear of Jack Dan if they've heard of him, it's through ghost stories, right? In 1848, the 70-year-old Jack Dan had surveyed the recent printing of his labors on the Manchu translation of 128 stories from Pu Songling's Strange Tales from a Chinese studio, okay? This is his Liujia Zhi Bitre Shutuqin. Now, this translated ghosts, monks, foxes, other metamorphosing bodies from Chinese into Manchu, and it's fabulous. It's wonderful, and any of you who are interested in Pu Songling's tales, there's some great stuff in here. Now, in his preface, he explains why he did this in the first place, or at least he gives us a story about this. Whether or not this is actually what happened, we really can't say. So according to him, and this is why this is interesting, because part of what he says motivated him to translate Pu Songling's stories into Manchu has something to do with how he understands the Manchu language and the particular kind of work that Manchu can do. And so in this preface, I think we get a little bit of a glimpse of how he's thinking about Manchu as a technology, okay, as a medium and as a technology. Okay, so he says, Manchu is the language of my homeland and my people. And he goes on to describe the musical tones of Manchu. So he's specifically commenting on the musicality of Manchu in terms of yin and yang, okay? And the cosmological resonance of language and translation continues to be a theme for him. He's really interested in, and in the poems he often talks about, Suktun, which is the Manchu for qi, basically. And he's really concerned with the relationship between yin, yang, the 5 phases, and language, and Manchu in particular. So I think it's really, really interesting. He says, lofty translators had worked with the texture of these tones of Manchu to render imperial editions of some major Chinese classical texts into Manchu, and those include some of the 4 books in the 5 classics. So this is what he says about Manchu there, okay? Now, for Jack Dan, he claims he decided to do this translation both because of this resonance of Manchu, but also just because it was fun, okay? And he goes on to say, the text embedded moral instruction in jokes and play. And he says he's really interested in jokes and play and the way that they convey moral instruction. Now, if we believe him, and I don't know that we necessarily should, because he's so self-effacing in this work, but if we believe him, he didn't dare to attempt a translation of this literary playground until stumbling upon the work of another Manchu translator who impressed Jack Dan with the elegance of his translation of 5 of the stories, and Jack Dan takes it upon himself to do a whole lot more. He reports to have been so struck by the music in this story that he had to do this translation, okay? And he tells us about this in the preface, but what's important to know is that he also in the preface says, I couldn't afford to really have this printed. And so what happens, his nephews swoop in to save the day and fund him. And so there's a really interesting way of reading what's happening in this preface for some kind of a sense of also the economics of translation in this period. What did it cost, and how did this actually get funded? Okay, so we have this translator from the early to mid-19th century. Why do we care? What's the big deal? There's one manuscript of this book of poems that exists, who cares, right? All right, so aside from, for me, aside from being one of the only scholars who's actually left a literary corpus of Manchu poems and fiction, right, some translated, some not, here's someone who's also writing, again, about the social and cultural worlds of a translator working in the mid to late Qing. And it's really fascinating, again, because he's working across languages that I think are not yet at the forefront of our story of translation. So for me as well, this is particularly interesting because we have a case study here for thinking through the relationship between, for this poet, history and literature, history and poetry. Okay, and he's very, very concerned with this, right? He's also he's trying to, and he's, I think, successfully, compellingly succeeding in this, reconcile his work as a reader and translator of Chinese prose and Chinese poetry with his work as a creator of Manchu poetry. So I think it's really interesting. So let's look at some of his poems for the rest of the time and see what we can find there. And it's super cool. And I'm just going to give you little tastes, and then hopefully you'll be hungry for more and you'll want to learn much more about this. Bless you. Okay. So the first 7 volumes of this collection include 345 translations of Chinese poems, again ranging from Ming authors to poems penned in the Kangxi and Qianlong eras, to several volumes worth of work by Tang authors like Du Fu and Li Bai. Now, his wide reading in the Chinese literary canon influenced not only the themes that he wrote about, but also his poetic voice. Okay, so his poetic voice, I want to argue here, is very much the voice of a translator poet. Now, his Manchu verse was that of a translator intimately familiar with poetic Chinese language and with the corpus of classical Chinese poetry. Right? Not only did he include the names and storylines of some classical Chinese figures, but he also kind of reproduced some of the themes and images and tropes that we can see in his translations. All right, so let's do it. Now, we've already talked about his poems about how much it sucks to be a translator, sung drunkenly, a song mumbled in my sleep. I like to talk about that as the kind of translator's blues. That's what I call it in the book. But he was clearly concerned with his financial situation, okay? You can see, he talks about this throughout the work, and you can see here, I wanted to show you, this is a snapshot of the end of the preface to this, where you can actually see his name, okay? This is Jiakdan up there in Manchu, and again, that means pine. Now, he had resigned from his official duties, and thanks to a serendipitous meeting of a kindred spirit who encouraged him to write and translate these poems, he produced the volume. But again, like his other work, he didn't have the money to have it printed until it got funded by others. Now, in the preface to this work, he continues to bemoan the sorry state of the translator's profession in general and of his own finances in particular. And he says this even in the preface. He says, for every 1 or 2 moments of pleasure in his life, there have been 9 or 10 of suffering. He says, and this is the preface, he sometimes has only dried fruit to eat. His rank is negligible. He's wrinkled and skinny and senile. Nobody likes him. He's got a gray beard. He can't get a loan. He says, pawnbrokers reject him when he tries to sell his belongings. This is what he says, right? Now, again, he compares himself with wealthy, seal-bearing officials surrounded by retinues of aides and their objects, including scholars, men of paper, brush, ink, and inkstone. He says this. Mounted archers, these men are carried in sedan chairs. We've heard this already, right? They comport themselves elegantly. They have households brimming with precious objects and daughters-in-law, etc. Not him. Now, but he says, and one of the interesting things that comes out of this, and then we'll sort of move on from how much it sucks to be a translator, he says, that's okay, because my life of solitude in the mountains is beautiful. And he creates this sort of image of this house of luxury with precious objects and all the mirrors, or a circumstance that mirrors what all these rich guys have, but in the natural world. He says the mountain is his work of art. The river is his wash basin. His sumptuous fabrics are the green crepe of rippling water and the deep velvet of moss. He says the glowing waves are my patterned crystals. The frolicking fish and twittering birds are the company that he keeps. The quivering willows are his companions. Okay? So he goes on like this, right? The mists are my curtains, the rainbows are my belts, the moon is my lamp. We can talk about this later a little bit, and this is one of the main themes that permeates his work. Now, he also writes poems on old age, and I didn't promise you, I alluded that I would tell you a little bit about what's going on with the beard. One of his poems is this Hex of Offering to the beard god. Okay, so here again, it starts out like a lot of these do. I'm poor and unpopular, nobody likes me. He claims to be relying on social welfare and public services because he can't afford to support himself. He claims My beautiful white beard is the only thing that's attractive about me. Everything else is so ugly that people make fun of me. And this is what he says in this poem. And that's the end of the poem, and this is just what I want to give you a little taste of. He gives an offering to the beard god, which again is the only thing he thinks is good about him. And this offering is a bowl of pumpkin, a bowl of crust, a bowl of bird's nest, a bowl of hawthorn, a censer, and cream. The beard god. I just love that. I love that list. You know, what do you give to your beard? This is what you give to your beard. Now, one of the things that's really fascinating for me is that he's also writing a bunch of poems dedicated to major figures and events in Chinese history. And these are often heroic or tragic figures who have shown up in popular or classical Chinese literary works, drama, poems, Bannerman tales. They include a poem about the dream of Handan. Okay, and this is the first page of that poem here. Now he says, once upon a time, and this is a story that will be familiar to many of you, especially those of you who work on Chinese literature. Once upon a time, there was a man named Lu Sheng. On the way to the capital to sit for an exam, he stopped to rest at an inn in the city of Handan. Some of you might recognize this already. There he meets an immortal who gives him a special pillow to sleep on. Now Lu Sheng fell asleep, and he dreamt an entire life for himself, when then suddenly he woke up and realized that so little time had passed that the yellow millet the innkeeper was boiling for his supper hadn't even finished cooking. Okay? Now, after understanding the life he had just experienced had been only a dream in this story, as we get it from Jack Donne, like this is all in this poem, he dramatically changed his life. He set off for a mountain and he becomes a recluse on a mountain. Now, this story was inspired by a Kunshu opera written by Ming author Tang Xianzu, but Jack Donne added his own interpretation before launching into the verse that he composed about and to sort of translate what's happening in this drama. And here's why I think this is really interesting, okay? Not just because he's invoking and retelling some of these stories, he's really interested in dreaming and in what dreaming can do for us, okay? For him, this story offers an opportunity to think about the nature of dreaming, the bond between dreaming and the physical body, and the scalar relationships between the lifespan of a single dream and the lifespan of an entire generation. And he's really interested in the movement from to and from scales like this in the poems, okay? He's really, really interested in thinking throughout the poems about kind of the scale of an individual life and the scale of a generation and what we can learn moving to and from these levels, okay? So this looking backward for him seems to be a way of looking forward into possible futures. He has a kind of anticipatory sensibility, and we see that in other works as well, okay? I'll show you a utopian work in a moment. But here's another poem because it has a murdering palace maid, and who doesn't love that? Okay, this is on stabbing Illegible. And here, he's praising palace maid Fei Zhen'e's loyalty to the Ming. So here we have a Manchu poet praising a Ming loyalist, okay? Okay, so according to it's really interesting, according to this Manchu poem, this palace maid pretends to be a princess, okay? She intends to assassinate rebel Li Zhicheng, okay? But she's arranged to marry a general of his army who's known as Illegible. When Illegible gets drunk on their wedding night, it's this fascinating moment in this poem. Fei kills him in revenge for the lost Ming Emperor Chongzhen. And the text ends with Fei's suicide after she unveils her true identity in front of the servants in his residence. In a Manchu poem. I mean, it's just really interesting. He loves this palace maid. He seems to love that she did this, and it's just awesome. Okay? Now, this is the first couple of pages from another work in which I think he's also interested in this movement of scale. This is his poem about the peach blossom spring, which is really interesting, right? This is a tale of a 4th century fisherman who wanders into a kind of utopian community descended from ancestors who had fled Qin rule and consequently became cut off from the outside world. I'm not going to say anything more. And one of the things that's been happening in the past 5-10 years or so is as a kind of footnote, the landscape of Manchu documents is very different from the landscape of Chinese documents. We're dependent on materials in rare books rooms, in archives, and there's still materials that are coming to light that we didn't know about. And so, for example, in the past, I think 5-10 years, people working in catalogs and working in libraries and archives in Germany, in Russia, and Inner Mongolia are coming across manuscripts of poems and of other literary sources that we just didn't know existed before. So part of what's happening right now is that as the field expands and moves from, I think, on memorial documents, right, and the very kind of straightforward sort of administrative history or frontier history kinds of questions, the field is now starting to change as more people are getting trained in Manchu who have different kinds of questions. More people are asking questions about literary Manchu and thus going into collections and looking for or finding or getting told by other people who incidentally did that these sources exist. So what I think that is showing us is that there was a lot more than just Jack Dan happening out there in terms of people writing poetry, but also fiction and also music in Manchu. But we're still trying to get a sense of not just the scope of the archive, but also how fragmentary that archive is relative to what was actually going on. Some really interesting work coming out of that is happening by people who are looking at Manchu language schools, and also sort of examinees and the sort of records that they're leaving to get a sense of what kinds of things and the range of sorts of things that people are writing. So I can't argue. I can't say it's not the case, but I can't confidently argue that Jack Dan's part of a state project that's devoted to literary Manchu. I can say that from the earliest Qing sources that we have that are there were projects to translate Chinese text into Manchu, and some of those were fiction works. So we have a Manchu Jinping Mei, we have a Manchu Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and there are some other novels and books that were chosen to translate into Manchu, and that was a state-supported project. How much that encompasses what's going on here, I don't know yet. Definitely, and I think, and I'll just briefly treat the first question, definitely I think the fact that Jack Dan had access to the kind of education and the ability to take the kinds of exams that gave him an income and put him in a position to have the resources to do this work, even if this work was like side work that he was doing, came from a state imperative to create more create more of an institutional infrastructure for revitalizing training in the Manchu language. And that included an examination system and changes to the examination system, but it also included banner schools, and it included garrison schools and things like that. And so I think he's a product of the kind of efforts to revitalize Manchu language use and training that didn't originate with him and that sort of predated him, but that were probably crucial for allowing this to happen.
I wonder if he ever talked about how he feels about his Manchu identity, Manchu nationality. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that he resorts to Chinese literary history for inspiration, and he praises Ming loyalist.
Yeah, right.
So where is his sense of Manchu nationality, and did he feel unprivileged? Not just because he's a poor poet / translator, but also because he's a Manchu poet. Mm-hmm. And did he ever feel at any point that there's something Manchu poetry can do and Chinese poetry cannot? For example, we talked about, in the previous panel, we heard a presentation about the visual play of Chinese characters. Yeah. Chun is a new poet, but the visual play in Chinese poetry is not that new. Yeah. In the full genre, sometimes we can have a whole line of poem made up with characters with the same radical. Mm-hmm. It's a visual play that Chinese poetry can do, while English poetry can hardly do. I wonder if there's something similar in the consciousness of these particular Manchu poets.
Right. So I can't claim to say anything about the consciousness of Jack Dan as a person, right? So I don't have access to that, but what I can say is in the prefatory material that he's left, both at the beginning of the volume of poems,
but also in the preface to his translation of Pusaling's stories, he performs a real palpable pride in being Manchu. He talks about the Manchu homeland. He's proud of the language. He thinks Manchu can do things and can evoke ideas that Chinese can't. So he's very upfront about at least performing a sense that there's something special about Manchu language that's crucial to Manchu identity, and that's part of him and who he is. He's fundamentally Manchu. So his performance of this, he does not in this material ever say, also, Chinese is amazing and I know it, and I'm really proud of the fact that I know it. That comes out of just reading his work, right? So that's something that I think we have to take out of what he's actually doing in the poems. It's not something that he comes out and says, and I'm also proud that I know Chinese. Chinese is great too, in the way he says about Manchu. Okay, so what I'm doing here is just showing you there is a way. I just came back from, actually end of last week, Sunday, I think. I just came back from a big Manchu Studies conference at Michigan. And two of us were talking about Jack Dan in very, very different ways. But one of the things that came up at that conference is that if you actually look at the page, we were talking, so one of the issues that came up, and this is, I think this kind of thing is interesting. You may not think this is interesting, but some people were saying, see, these sounds are different, it doesn't rhyme. And other people were saying, well, what is rhyme? You know, like, can we talk about rhyme? Is there visual rhyme? Are there half rhymes? Like, what is rhyme? And maybe we need to expand that a little bit. One of the things that came up is if you look at this page, you see toward the middle, the line, there's a dot. Okay, the dots are marking breaks, sort of line breaks. You see there's this sort of line of dots that goes across. And there's a way of just visually rendering the ends of the words. He seems very much... I mean, there's an artistry here, and there's sort of a visuality to what's going on that's not necessarily in other Manchu texts that I've seen. Like, there's really a self-consciousness. Here's what I can say. There's a self-consciousness about the way the words look on the page. And if you actually look through the poems, there are ways in which, just kind of visually, there's an artistry to how it looks on the page. It's not just about the calligraphic style, right? It's about the relationship between words and among words that are on the page. So it's very different from what's happening in Chinese, but I think there is an attentiveness to something that we might think of in terms of there's some attentiveness to the visuality of the experience of the poems on the page for the reader.